We are in the midst of examining the 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism. And it occurs to me that you might wonder, why 6? Why just 6? Why not 72? Why not 435? And it's a good question. One of the answers is that that's how decision-making works, right? You make a decision and then it stays for a long, long time. But the sources have changed over time as well. The sources support a shared understanding of our uncommon Unitarian Universalist denomination. They support the understanding that revelation is not sealed and that wisdom comes from many sources. The sources provide some institutional support in that way. However, even more important, the sources provide personal support. In this living tradition, meaning is made as we go along. We encourage each individual to a free and responsible search for truth and meaning in our 7 principles, which may be more familiar to a lot of you. However, we do not expect that search to be aimless wandering. It can be wandering, but not all who wander are lost. We provide the sources, not so much as a map, but maybe more like compass points. So today we turn our attention to our 3rd source, wisdom from the world's religions, which inspires us in our ethical and spiritual life. Now, there are entirely too many examples of this source from the many religions of the world to fit into a month of Sundays. I am more interested in this moment in the relationship between Unitarian Universalism and the world's religions, a relationship within the family of world religions, and what that relationship says about our identity, our history, and our heritage. This source connects us not just to Unitarian ancestors like Francis David and King John Sigismund and their early venture into religious tolerance, which was actually not quite as absolute as the story I told earlier might have sounded. There were 4 specific religions that were affirmed, and then people who were adherents to other faiths like Islam they weren't persecuted, but they weren't exactly given a seat at the table, right? It's actually a much more interesting and complicated story involving like the Ottoman Empire and political intrigues in Hungary. And I was going to tell you that whole story, but then my sermon was like half an hour long. So I'm going to put it in the newsletter column, which I know everybody reads diligently every week. This source also connects us directly to some of our most well-known American ancestors as Unitarians, the Transcendentalists. You may have heard of some of these guys. In the 19th century, the Transcendentalists were some of the first people to bring Hindu texts and texts from other Eastern religions, Asiatic religions, texts and ideas to America. And they became an active part of the intellectual life of New England's famous literary figures, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and a number of others whose names are a little bit less familiar to those of us who have taken English Literature 101. As early as the 1820s, Emerson wrote of India, and by the 1830s, he had copies of Hindu sacred texts, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, and the Law of Manu. He was especially attracted to these texts because they spoke of a unity of the spirit, linking the human soul and the transcendent, what he called the unbounded, unboundable empire. Emerson and his circle came to be called Transcendentalists because of their emphasis on the transcendent oneness of spirit. And among liberal Unitarians in New England, many were drawn to what they learned, particularly of India's religious ideas, its insistence on the oneness of the divine, a deep linkage of the soul and the divine, and the transcendent unity of many paths and ways. So we are in good company when we proclaim our faith in the essential transcendental unity. According to Gandhi, who was Hindu but was deeply influenced by the nonviolent teachings of Jesus, belief in one God is the cornerstone of all religions. The Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and beyond, affirms that the essential message of all religions is essentially the same. It's a vision that is invoked around the world when people of many faiths gather in peace and friendship and share a common cause. We prize our commitment to oneness and to unity. But in our modern multi-faith world, where the world's religions are also our neighbors, I wonder if that is enough. Good people I put before you today, on one hand, Francis David, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Gandhi, and the Dalai Lama. And on the other hand, we have me, questioning all of them. Good thing I'm humble. I don't mean to brag, but that's part of the point. Good thing I'm a Unitarian Universalist, because this act of questioning deeply held beliefs and testing them in different lights and against new realities, this is our identity and heritage too. Matthew Fox, who is a contemporary theologian that I admire and respect, uses an analogy of an underground river which feeds many different wells in many different places to describe a religious pluralist landscape. One river and many wells. It's actually the title of one of his books. The underground river is the religious impulse of all humanity, and the many wells are the various ways that different religions have expressed that religious impulse. But as we look out across a world that seems to be tearing itself apart at the seams, a world where a lot of that tearing happens along religious lines, I think it's worth kicking the tires and checking under the hood of this particular article of faith. It's only natural that we would prefer to focus on what religions have in common rather than what they do not share. But I don't think we're doing ourselves any favors if that is all we do. Because the problem with believing all religions share the same essence is that someone has to decide, and we would have to agree on what essence that was. In his book, God is Not One, Stephen Prothero says, the world's religious rivals do converge when it comes to ethics, but they diverge sharply on doctrine, ritual, mythology, experience, law. These differences may not matter to mystics, but they matter to ordinary religious people. Muslims do not think that the pilgrimage to Mecca, they call the Hajj, is inessential. Catholics do not think that baptism is inessential. It's true that there are similarities. The golden rule in some form is found in Christianity, in Judaism, in Confucianism, and Hinduism. But some shared ethical precepts don't mean that all religions are essentially the same. There are obvious differences. The question is, are those differences non-essential while the essentials are shared, or are the differences essential? This word essential is a value word, and values are assigned. And it is no surprise that a lot depends on who does the assigning. There's this thing called confirmation bias, which you may have heard of. We see what we expect to see, what confirms our own reality, our own understanding. Like when I am on the phone with somebody and they ask me my husband's name when they find out I'm married, and I have to say, well, my wife's name is Sydney, and they go, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Hopefully I have challenged a little bit of that confirmation bias. But it happens in religion too. When a group of people gathers and affirms that God is one, every person in the room is confident that that one God, the one that God looks a lot like the God that they know and worship and believe in. The oneness we are most likely to see wears the most familiar face. It holds close the same things we hold dearest. It speaks familiar words. But that one is not the same for everyone. Different religions have different understandings, not only about the essential problems of the world, but also about their remedies. The oneness of God and the unity of the world religions is a reality, but it's a two-dimensional reality that doesn't tell the whole story. Just as surely as the things that we hold in common in this congregation do not tell each of your individual religious stories. This idea of unity, that we are all essentially the same, minimizes our differences, and our differences are part of what make the world beautiful. Minimization has its own set of problems, because truly respecting another religion or another culture or another person requires respecting and appreciating its uniqueness, just as we would expect others to see us in all our beautiful uniqueness. Papering over our differences and insisting on what's more important is the sameness is a deliberate blindness to some of the things that the other person or the other culture or that the other religion regards as crucially important about themselves. It's putting others in a box guided by our own definition of sameness instead of letting them define themselves. You could almost say it's the difference between the truth and a truth. Because the truth, it turns out, rarely only contains one truth. We are all looking out our own windows. In reality, the religions of the world are centered around different ideas about God, the nature of suffering, the path to salvation, and on and on and on and on. We certainly are. And until we can enter into dialogue around that difference as well as our shared and common humanity, we're only engaging with the world as we hope it to be, not as it is. We balance particularity and universality in this kind of dialogue. We do this as individuals, and we do this as a world community of religions. Particularity provides a way for each to claim context, culture, beliefs. Universality provides a way for us to discover common elements so that particular elements can be seen in harmony. As Ramon Panikkar describes in his metaphor of looking out the windows and seeing different things, we learn that more than one thing can be true at once. Instead of seeing the world's religions as drawing from a single river or as paths up a single mountain, it might be more accurate to say that the world's religions begin from the same place and then head off in different directions. Stephen Prothero explains it this way: what the world's religions share is not so much a finish line as a starting point. They begin with this simple observation: something is wrong with the world. What is it? For Christianity, what's wrong is sin. So Christianity heads out to climb the mountain or swim in the river to salvation from sin. For Buddhism, what's wrong is suffering. So Buddhists head out to drink from the river of nirvana, extinguishment, release from the cycle of rebirth and suffering. For Islam, what's wrong is pride, the hubris of acting as if you can get along without God. So Islam heads out to drink from the well of submission and obedience. For Judaism, the problem is exile and distance from God. So Judaism seeks to follow the law to return to God. Now, these are broad generalizations, which are not uniformly true, disclaimer. However, in the history of these religions, these are the trends and the motivating factors. These are not different wells drawing the same water. These are different waters quenching the same thirst. Living in a multi-faith world is often described as one of two polarities. Either all religions are in their heart the same and should unite in common cause, or religious rivalry. This multi-faith reality is an existential threat, a battle for the soul of humanity. Too often, literally a battle. But it doesn't have to be a battle. We can choose a different story for world religions, not one of dominance or survival of the fittest, and not the minimization of difference in favor of a vague conformity and unity, but interdependence of all. We can't give up our idealism. Our common humanity and our commitment to a shared purpose are woven deeply into the fabric of Unitarian Universalism. But we also know that we cannot live on idealism alone, because we don't live in that theoretical world. We live in this one, which calls for both clear eyes and committed hearts, to make room for multiple truths to coexist and commingle, to avoid the minimization that reduces everything to the lowest common denominator. We begin at home by paying attention to our own uniqueness as a religion. And when we do that, we start to see differences not as variations on a theme, but as part of a complex whole, a more complex reality. In her book, Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Marie Brown writes of complexity quite a bit. And she says, we have to embrace our complexity. We are complex. While many of us articulate a yearning for a more simple life, we continue practicing complexity as our evolutionary path. I've grown an appreciation for the simplicity, while also understanding that I enjoy it as a visitation. Being in a complex life is actually intriguing and delicious to my system. And I have to understand that it isn't just my one complexity at work, but everyone I am in relationship with. An abundance of connections, desires, interactions, reactions. I have begun to wonder how it looks to practice complexity as a sacred path, as interdependence. Brown refers to a sign on the wall of her mentor Grace Lee Boggs's home. And the sign read, "Building community is to the collective as spiritual practice is to the individual." If each religion is rooted in its own ideas about the problems of humanity and their solutions, where do we start to define those roots for ourselves? What is the fundamental premise of our faith, where we hold a diversity of beliefs and serve as kind of a microcosm for the many faiths of the world? I think practicing complexity as a sacred path and building community as collective spiritual practice seem like a good place to start.